part 1, I made up the jigumi, and it's now time to work on the tsukeko, or inner frame. From the diagram I showed in part 1, the top and bottom pieces are 276mm and the side pieces are 176. So rough cut 2 pieces about 325mm and 2 pieces about 225. Select the best faces and place cabinet maker's triangle to indicate top, bottom and left, right. Next, mark the inside face of one of the side tsukeko. Place the vertical story stick in the jig, then orient the side piece so the bottom is towards the end stop. Remember, all vertical pieces are oriented towards the bottom, and this is the pencil mark you placed on the vertical kumiko. Rotate the piece so the inside face is facing upwards. Place this on a scrap piece of 4mm kumiko to bring the side frame piece even with the top of the story stick for ease of marking. Clamp all pieces together so they don't move. With the marking knife, mark the inside of the mitres all the way across the face. This was the tenon shoulder mark for the kumiko. You don't need to worry about the marks for the ends of the tenons. Mark each of the joints only in the centre of the face. Avoid marking these all the way across. Make sure you place a pencil mark showing the side of the knife mark that the joint will fit. In this case it's the mortise. This mark is critical, and you'll realise this when you drill the mortises. Next, transfer the knife and pencil marks to the other side piece. I normally mark both of these together, but in the early stages and until you become totally used to the process, it's probably worthwhile marking these separately. Make sure your orientation is correct, then open them out so the inside faces are facing upwards. Secure them together so they don't move, and transfer the knife and pencil marks. Next, repeat this process for the top and bottom tsukeko. The next step is to drill the 4mm mortises. I have a drill press, but provided you're careful, a normal handheld drill will work just as well. Just make sure you keep the drill bit perpendicular to the piece. Secure a 4mm bit in the drill and set the fence so the cut is right on the centre line. Set all pieces so that the cabinet maker's triangle is facing you or facing the fence. It doesn't matter, but all pieces have to face the same way for consistency. Carefully drill so that the edge of the bit just touches the knife mark you made, and make sure you drill the mortise on the pencil side of the mark. One thing you'll notice is that the cuts will alternate between the right and left hand side of the knife mark as you drill one side piece, then the other. or the top piece, then the bottom. Be conscious of this when drilling, and watch for the pencil marks. This is why it was so important to place those pencil marks. Next, mark the end miters in all of the pieces with the 45-degree gauge and a pencil. It's quite easy to make a mistake here, so make sure you have the miters facing the correct way. I place a pencil mark on the back as well, so I can follow that with my cut and not cut into the miter. And cut the pieces just on the waist side of the pencil marks to rough miter length. Hopefully at the end of that, you should have a roughly cut rectangle that will join together. The next and final step is to trim the ends to length using the 45-degree jig. Make sure you only trim down to the miter knife mark and no more. It's also important to make sure you trim far enough. The difference between too long, too short and just right is only a couple of shavings. Now comes the moment of truth, when it all comes together. It's time to attach the tsukeko to the jigumi. This is absolutely critical. Make sure you have the correct orientation for the tsukeko and also for the jigumi. Top, bottom, left and right. It's all in those pencil marks. Put the side pieces to one side and put a reasonable amount of glue in the mortises in the top and bottom pieces first. Wipe off any excess glue, then insert the top and bottom pieces so the tenons register in their respective mortises. Don't try to force them all the way in at this stage. Tap the top and bottom pieces home with a hammer. Make sure you tap all the way along the piece and don't concentrate in one place only. Keep tapping until the top and bottom pieces are fully seated. The image is cut off a bit at the top, so it's not totally clear. But what I'm doing here is using a scrap piece of wood and tapping next to the mortise to make sure the tenons are completely in and there are no gaps. Check that there are no gaps, then wipe away any excess glue. Next, work on the side pieces. Make sure the top-bottom orientation is correct and double check that the jigumi is also back in its correct top, bottom, left, right orientation. It's easy to overlook that it may have been flipped around when tapping the top and bottom pieces in. Glue the mortises in the side pieces the same way as for the top and bottom, and this time put plenty of glue on all mitre faces. The end grain will suck up a lot of the glue, and there's nothing worse than a glue-starved joint. Any excess will just be squeezed out, and this can be cleaned up at the end. Same as the top and bottom pieces, register the tenons in the mortises and tap the pieces in. Again, unfortunately, it's cut off at the top, but all I'm doing here is tapping the pieces in directly with the hammer, then using a scrap piece to tap next to the mortises to make sure there are no gaps. This is a later shot, but it shows how I was tapping in with a scrap piece of wood. Clean up the glue and just do a final check to make sure there are no gaps. For the final step, drill a 1.5mm pilot hole through each of the mitres from the side pieces and hammer in 20mm by 1.6mm nails to keep the mitre secure. And don't let anyone tell you it's bad form to use nails. They're a tool, the same as any other tool, and these will be hidden at any rate once the piece is fitted into an outer frame. That's the difficult part finished. It's now onto the easy and the fun part, making up the asa-no-ha pattern. For the pattern pieces, I use the pattern kumiko with a mitsuke of 3mm. First, cut and insert the diagonal pieces. The diagram shows a length of 65.1mm, but this is only a guide. Rough cut 8 pieces to about 66 or 67mm long, then trim both ends of each piece to fit. This should be a firm fit, but you shouldn't have to force them in. Don't apply any glue to these pieces. Continue until you've completed all the diagonal pieces. Next, cut and insert the hinge pieces and locking pieces. I explain how to do this in detail in my asa-no-ha coaster video, so you should also refer to that. I'll put a link in the descriptions below. Rough cut at least 32 hinge pieces to 35 or 36mm, and at least 16 locking pieces to about 20mm. To start off, cut one end of 4 or 5 hinge pieces on the 67.5 degree jig to a ratio of just over 2/3 on one side and just under 1/3 on the other. The three-dimensional diagram at the start of part 1 shows this ratio. Now trim the other ends on the 22.5 degree jig. Pairs of hinge pieces should be exactly the same length. This way all of the locking pieces will line up in a straight line when it's all finished. To fit, make any adjustments you need to the 22.5 degree end. Getting the point in the middle is always easier than going backwards and forwards trying to judge the 2/3 plus and 1/3 minus ratio. And remember, the 2/3 side opens out to house the locking piece. Don't get this around the wrong way or the pieces won't fit. Now trim the locking pieces to fit on the 45 degree jig. Continue testing and trimming until you get a firm fit. Only insert the locking piece about 1mm when testing. If it goes in firmly for 1mm, it will go in the rest of the way. If you push it in all the way when testing, you're only going to have to get the piece out again. When there's a firm fit, it's time for some glue. Place a dab of glue in each of the hinge corners and reinsert the hinge pieces. Make sure they join cleanly in the centre. Then scrape some glue at the top of the hinge opening and the top of the opposite corner and insert the locking piece for a final tight fit. Continue this process until you finally insert the final locking piece. The project is nearly finished. The only step left is to clean up the front and back so there's a clean, smooth surface. On small pieces such as this, I normally run it through the drum sander. On larger pieces, I go the traditional way and clean the faces up with a very sharp kanda. That now completes the project. I hope it was interesting and of some value if you decide to try your own asa-no-ha project. As I mentioned in part 1, I'll have a look at an outer frame for this in a future video. All the best and thanks for watching.